Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to our talk tonight with George Frampton, carbon pricing and the future of U.S. climate policy. Now, speaking of climate, I flew in today from the U.S. and I flew through it via Zurich. And as we were coming to Zurich, the pilot said, it's sunny in Zurich and there are no winds and it's 17 degrees. And then he paused and he said, and that's really weird at this time of year. That's quite warm for Switzerland. Anyway, George is going to be talking about such complex matters tonight. He's our Richard C. Holbrooke Fellow this current semester, and that's a fellowship, as you know, was set up in the memory of the founder of the Academy, Richard Holbrooke, and one of our original donors to the Richard Holbrooke Fellowship, Alexander Georgiev, is with us tonight, and we're very grateful for your support, continuing support. Thank you so much. Also delighted to recognize the Canadian ambassador, Stéphane Dion, who's here also with us, who is not only ambassador here, but was formerly a Minister of the Environment in Canada. So he also knows what he's talking about, and we're expecting some good questions from you, Ambassador, later on. Our speaker tonight, George Frampton, was Assistant Secretary of the Department of Interior and also the Chair of the Council on Environmental Quality under President Clinton's administration. He was also Assistant Special Prosecutor in the Watergate investigation, which produced a book, which is interesting given our current situation. And he was President of the Wilderness Society as well. He's currently he co-founded an environmental nonprofit advocacy organization called Partnership for Responsible Growth, and that's what's taking up a lot of his time now, and that's what he will be referencing as he gives us his talk tonight. George.
Thank you, Terry. Is this on? Can you hear me? All right, I'll try to put that up there. Thank you, Terry, who's become quite effective and graceful leader here in a short time, I think, and the staff of the Academy who have made it really wonderful for us fellows to be here and support us. I'm going to plagiarize one of my colleagues, in case some of you weren't here in an earlier lecture that he gave. Fred Donner has said that coming here as a fellow is a little like going to heaven without the inconvenience of having to die first. And that's really, I've been using that with other people. So, and thank you to donors who created this, support this fellowship. So my goal here tonight is really to try to stimulate a little bit of a conversation about the challenge that climate change poses for all of us. And to do that by talking just for a few minutes about the different ways that the EU and Germany and the US have approached climate policy in the past 10 or 15 years, but to make the point that some of the issues that we face the next 10 years, 2020 to 2030, to decarbonize the first and fourth largest economies in the world, are quite similar issues. And some of them you may not have read very much about or thought very much about. And those are, quickly, one, how do we get the price right, which almost all experts and economists will tell you that if we're going to do this job, we need to figure out how to put a price into the market on greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emissions mostly, that reflect the real costs that we incur on the environment and the economy because of these emissions, but which don't get assigned any price in the marketplace. So getting a healthy price that's predictable and increasing is very important. Second issue is what do we do about transport emissions? And as I'll say in a moment, most of the emissions reductions and the progress we've made in the EU and in the US in the last 10 or 15 years have been by getting coal emissions down, decreasing the amount of coal used in the power sector and manufacturing, in heat and waste in Germany particularly as well. But there are substitutes for coal, renewable energy, natural gas, efficiency, storage. So you can imagine in the world as a whole a gradual phase down and even phase out of coal at some point because there are substitutes. But we don't have any economically viable substitutes for hydrocarbon fuels, cars, trucks, trains, airplanes. There's nothing there. And even if we were to try to substitute a completely different system, electrify our transport fleet, biofuels, hydrogen for fuel cells, that means a massive new infrastructure which doesn't exist either. So in the long term, getting rid of coal may be the easy part, but dealing with transportation emissions is going to be the hard part. And the third issue I want to talk about briefly is how do we provide for a just transition for those communities and people who are hurt the worst, and that starts with coal workers. So going back to similarities and differences, when I came here 6 weeks ago, I expected that I would find that there is a lot to admire and emulate about the way the EU has addressed the climate change challenge in the last 15 years. In Germany, this started really 2001, 2002, more than 10 years in the EU. There's a plan, there's a program. In the EU now, for more than 10 years, there's been a working cap and trade system in which 13,000 different facilities have caps and have to lower their emissions every year, and they can trade permits, which makes it more economical. That's been going. Germany phased out hard coal, just agreed to a program to phase out lignite coal, or at least a coalition of people have agreed on a proposition to do that. Subsidized renewable energy, had fairly high prices for fuel and electricity, which encourage efficiency and savings. So, and the business community seems, compared to the United States, pretty supportive, or at least if not strongly supportive, accepting of this program. So, that's pretty impressive. What isn't to like about that? And it's all true, it is impressive. But when I got here, I find that, there is another way of looking at some of this, and in talking to people, particularly in the policy community, think tanks, and I would say more on the green side, some people say to me, well, in some ways this whole program has kind of been a failure. First of all, we started out in the last 10 years with not a very high ambition. The cap and trade system was supposed to, called the emissions trading system, EU ETS, was supposed to produce a trading price that was, a real incentive to people to make investments in lower carbon technologies. And instead of the price being 25 or 30 euros, it went down to 3 or 4 and stayed there for 7 years. And so the opportunity to incentivize a lot of change has been lost. And incidentally, transportation emissions haven't gone down. And the prices of our taxes aren't geared to CO2, clean or dirty. And so in the end, of course, the business community is pretty accepting of this because they haven't really had to do very much that they wouldn't otherwise have had to do. So however you look at this, you're looking back, whatever judgment you make, you can say, this is a glass 3/4 full or a glass 1/4 empty. However you look at it, one thing is clear, and that is that what's been done so far in Europe is the easy part. And looking forward, the reason you can tell that is because now with a climate agreement, Paris Climate Accord, and countries taking targets, the EU has taken a target for 2030, and that's going to be built into the legal framework. Individual countries are going to get their pieces of that, but according to the problem is that according to the planning that was pretty much crystallized in 2014 and finalized last year in 2018, all the plans don't get the EU to its Paris target. Don't get there. So there is going to be a pretty interesting political discussion and perhaps battle, maybe not until after the EU elections this spring and a new government forms up in the fall, but it's obviously already started in Germany. How do we get to the target that we've set for ourselves? How do we ramp up? How do we tighten the policy? Who's going to pay for this, and how is it going to be done? And that's going to be a very interesting and a very difficult discussion. Now, having said that, that's a lot better than the United States because we haven't had any policy for 10 years at all. And yet, it's interesting that U.S. CO2 emissions have actually decreased over the last 10 years, 12, 13, 14%, which is, incidentally, a lot more than Germany's emissions have decreased because they haven't decreased more than maybe 1% in 10 years. EU emissions are coming down, Germany's not. So in the U.S., we've made a little bit of progress over the last 10 years, but it's not really because we have a comprehensive policy. We have some fragments of policy. We've subsidized solar and wind. We have provided loan guarantees. We have efficiency standards. We have regulations that require automobiles and light trucks to be made, and now heavy trucks to be made more efficient every year. And we have some states, particularly California, which when it comes to climate change is like a rocket taking off from the west coast of the United States, the fifth largest economy in the world. So all of those things have helped make some progress on climate in the United States, but 80% of what we've done is really just because of the fracking revolution and cheap natural gas, which we have a lot of and will go on being cheap. And so the cheap gas knocks out the coal, outcompetes the coal. So in the United States, we too have done the easy part, the really easy part. And somebody I talked to in the last couple of weeks, I think, put this really well by saying, well, in Europe, we've agreed on the basics. There's a consensus on the basics. There's just not yet any consensus on the consequences. In other words, we've agreed that this is an important priority for our society, our economy. We're going to decarbonize. Here are some of the ways we're going to do it. Shouldn't be dependent on which parties or which country, but we've made a commitment to do this. What there's no consensus about is the consequences, namely how fast are we going to go, who's going to go first, and who's going to pay for it. In the U.S., we have no consensus about the basics and no consensus about the consequences. So that's a lot harder. I should mention Ambassador Dion has been party leader and environment minister and involved for 20 years in the front line of efforts to do good things on climate change in Canada. And actually, Canada is a country that now, at least for the moment, has a consensus on the basics and a consensus on the consequences. And probably the world's leading program, moving toward from a $10 to a $50 carbon price across the country, a little bit of a hybrid. Some provinces can do it their own way, but if they don't, then they're subject to a tax. All the tax money goes back to citizens. So it's a very adeptly done. And the question is whether that will continue. And it has a lot of business support. It came about primarily because a fair amount of business support. But it may depend on whether the current prime minister is reelected, party's reelected, and it may depend on whether business support continues. And I say that because in Australia, there's the counterexample. Australia worked for 6 or 7 years to build up support for a carbon tax. They were able to secure multi-party support, they thought, business support. They designed a good program. They enacted it. They put it into effect. And a year and a half later, a different government was elected, and the carbon tax was out the window in 2 or 3 months. So that's the danger, that you don't make something, fashion something that's resilient and that can survive parties, changes, and maybe country debates within the EU and over time. So I promised you to talk just briefly about 3 issues that I think we face in the U.S. and the EU and Germany face, getting the price right. What's happened in Germany is that the price isn't right to date, and the question is, if we're really going to make more progress, there has to be a higher predictable, steady price in the economy, or it's not going to happen. Even the coal phase-out probably doesn't work. How do you do that in the EU? Originally, Germany and other countries, some other countries, in 2001 to 2003, wanted a carbon tax. But a carbon tax in the EU takes the unanimous vote of all the countries. So instead, they went to this cap-and-trade system. Well, cap-and-trade and a carbon fee or a carbon tax are different ways to give you a price, put a price into the economy. But one, the tax, you can fix, and it's predictable. You can say what it's going to be every year for the next 10 years. Cap-and-trade system seems to be very fragile when it comes to, you can't really control what the price is, and if it doesn't really register, then you've lost that opportunity. So there are now the French originally, some other countries, the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries would like to see Europe move to a carbon tax, but that's almost clearly not going to happen because of the unanimity requirement. In the EU, a majority or two-thirds of the countries can vote to put some sort of regulatory regime on the whole EU, but it takes every single country to vote for a tax. So the cap and trade is a way of kind of getting a price but avoiding the unanimity. And that's probably not going to change. There are other proposals to put a floor price under the carbon, the price of the permits in the cap and trade system, sort of a hybrid. Some countries may do that. But there'll be all kinds of attempts to see, what mechanisms short of a 27 or 28 countries, depending on Brexit, vote for a tax could actually put a reasonably strong, predictable growing carbon price into the EU economy. Now, in the U.S., of course, as I said, we don't have any program and we don't have any agreement on the basics. Ironically, though, it may be that a direct carbon price, carbon fee, fuel fee, or a carbon tax of some kind is now much more likely to be the vehicle that attracts broad support, some bipartisan support, if we get a sympathetic president in 2021 and a Congress that wants to move forward. And we're going in that direction, and I'll say a word about that in a minute. And that's a little odd because people have always thought, carbon tax is just too radioactive to be an effective political program in the U.S. Look at France. Here, there's a lot of resistance to a direct price. Cap and trade, of course, sort of hides the price. But what's happened in the U.S. is that the dissatisfaction with the attempt 8 years ago to pass cap and trade legislation in the Congress and the flaws in the EU system and California's cap and trade system mean that there's a real sort of a flight from the idea of cap and trade. It's just not going to work for such a huge economy in an effective, uncomplicated way. So the program that's always been the least likely, a carbon tax, may be sort of rising to the top as the best candidate for a program in the U.S. And there are two reasons for that, in addition to dissatisfaction with the idea of cap and trade, which may have played itself out now as intellectually and politically. One is that a carbon tax in the U.S. would actually not involve any regulation. In fact, you can get rid of some existing regulation and future regulation. So that's attractive because if there's one thing that the Trump base, the traditional Republicans, and large segment of the business community all don't like, they all agree on they don't like regulation. So something that's anti-regulation, even though it's a tax, maybe looks a little bit more attractive. The other thing is that, let's say, a $35 or $40 a metric ton of CO2 tax produces about $2 trillion of new federal revenue over 10 years, which is about 10 times as much new revenue as anything else anybody's ever figured out that the Congress can do to raise new federal dollars. And we need that money because we're spiraling into debt and we have no money to do infrastructure investment. Now, a lot of that money probably would have to go back to low and middle income families to compensate them for increased energy prices. But you can compensate half to two-thirds of the population and still have $750 billion left over. So the money is another attractive, piece of the potential for a carbon tax. But, look, raising taxes is a problem every place. And my wife, who's an investment banker, once upon a time spent a lot of time in France, said, well, the yellow vest stuff is not about climate change. These taxi cab drivers and truck drivers in France, they all have yellow jackets, and they've all been out and burned cars and, rioted every 7 or 8 years against higher prices. This is not about climate change. But, of course, it is about climate change in this particular case. So it's another example of how hard it may be any place to have a significant increase in taxes which result in energy price increases. Transport, well, it's interesting that in the U.S., a lot of modeling that's been done shows that even a very high carbon tax across the economy, $50, $60, $70 per metric ton, which really reduces coal to zero much more quickly in the power sector, doesn't really make a big impact in the transportation sector. And the problems of trying to incentivize manufacturers to make more electric cars or a different kind of car, people to buy them when they're more expensive, and most important, how do you design and pay for an infrastructure of hundreds of thousands, let's say in the U.S., of electric charging stations? Those are really, really tough challenges, and very few people have thought about this in the U.S. California has a suite of programs that they've designed to try to decrease transportation emissions. So they have a low carbon fuel standard, a zero emission vehicle mandate, state tax credits to buy an electric car. But very little attention has been paid to whether you could take these relatively new policy programs and put them into effect at a national level. So we're way behind. And I certainly see in Germany some of the same, particularly because as car manufacturing is a leading industry and it's the pride of the country, the highest technological, achievement, and the car industry made a pretty big bet on making clean diesels for the world for the next 10 or 15 years. And now it turns out that, that strategy may have to be overhauled. In the meantime, Berlin and other cities are buying electric buses. There's nobody who makes electric buses to speak of in Germany. They're buying a few in Poland, but a company called BYD in China just delivered its 100,000th electric bus. Shenzhen decided to electrify their bus system. 3 years, 16,000 buses, it's done. So both in the U.S. and in Europe, catching up with the need potentially to electrify enormous transportation fleet and provide the infrastructure for it, that's going to be challenging. And finally, the challenge of a just transition. In the U.S., this is not economically and in terms of numbers a huge problem. There are 40 to 50,000 coal workers. The coal industry has been in decline for 20 years. It's almost 40% decrease just since 2011, 2012. But of course, President Trump has made a huge issue out of this. In Europe, Germany has some experience from the phase out of hard coal, but facing now the phase out of lignite, both in Germany and the EU, is going to be very challenging. For the first time, the EU set up a platform for coal communities in transition. It's going to become an agency. It's going to have a real existence and a budget starting this spring. They've identified 171 communities that are targets for transition, about 180,000 workers, another 40,000 in plants, power plants and industries that could be affected by a total phase out of lignite. So beginning to deliver, Germany has committed $1.5 billion till 2021, I think, this year to 2021, to begin the 3 major lignite areas in Germany that are where the lignite's going to be phased out. It's a bigger political challenge, even in the U.S., than I think people have realized, and maybe a bigger challenge here. But in terms of continuing to have public support for increasingly strong measures, guaranteeing that that these people are going to be taken care of is really important. Now, let me just finish by saying a couple words about the prospects, in more detail about the prospects and the politics in the U.S. Some of you have read about. I said I think that in the last 8 or 10 months, there's been the beginning of a major new upswelling of interest in and a desire to do something about climate change, finally. Now, President Trump may have ironically helped this along, because people are actually aware that every country in the world got together and agreed to do something. The climate's important. We got to do something about it. And so people who, let's say the business community, people who are environmentalists during the Obama administration, he was trying to do as much as he could for climate within the authority granted him. And, we were making a little progress. But now people look at the U.S. administration and say, well, everybody else in the world is going to do something, but our policy is we're never going to do anything at all, ever, nothing. That doesn't seem like a viable strategy, either domestic or world policy. So that may have helped a little bit, but I think just more, a part of it is generational. Most people in their 20s and early 30s in the U.S., 95% of those people support climate action. It was very different than people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. So part of that is now evidenced by some of the young people who got elected to Congress just in the last few months and came forward with an old idea and a new wrapping called the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal is sort of, we really have to do something about climate. We have to decarbonize the power sector. We have to do it all in 10 years. But actually, when you look at this Green New Deal program, most of it is not about climate. It's about health care and guaranteeing everybody an income and retirement. So it's a very complete liberal agenda of which climate change is sort of attached, with no policy at all. So no idea about nothing expressed about how to get there. So but the energy saying now is the time to do something about climate, even if there's no policy content, is very important. And I think this is going to grow. On the other side, you do have an increasing sort of conservative Republican interest in a carbon tax, revenue-neutral carbon tax, where all the money is, none is used for government expenditure. It all goes back to families, which conservatives like, because one of the big hits on a carbon tax in the past has been it's just a liberal scheme to get more money to the government, to grow government. And of course, if none of the money goes back to the government, that's that you take that objection away. So on the conservative side, pushing for a carbon tax. On the more liberal side, progressive side, you have a lot of energy around let's do something about climate change. But in the middle there is what? and that'll be interesting as our 2020 campaign, which unfortunately appears to have already started. If you live in the United States, you can hardly stand that, so it's nice to be in Berlin at this time. But the challenge there is you're running for president or running for some other office. You're a fairly liberal Democrat. You're an environmentalist. You've been supporting aggressive climate action for 10 or 15 years. What do you espouse? What's your program? What do you say that doesn't look so conciliatory and compromising and old, conventional, by the lights of the Green New Deal, that excites anybody? How do you capture the excitement of people who want to do something about climate and don't have a plan, and turn that into something that's practical and can actually gain broad public support. And I think that is in the next 6 or 9 months, as this campaign develops, that's sort of the thing to watch. How does the mainstream pro-climate political community and environmental community and climate community in the U.S. formulate a policy that has a real hope of gaining public support going into the election in 2021 when you have such contrasting ideas about climate on both the left and perhaps also on the right. So I'm happy to take questions, and as I said, I realize it's a little risky to encourage a discussion because there are a bunch of people in this room who know a great deal more about the EU climate policy than I do. Some of you I've consulted with to try to educate myself. So I hope that you will feel free to tell me that I'm add to what I've said or tell me I'm all wrong about this, as you like.
If I may, let's start with this Green New Deal. So it's clearly the formulation comes from the New Deal, FDR, after the Depression, and a lot of the energy for that New Deal, which itself was quite controversial, came from a terrible depression that the United States went through. It seems to me that part of the challenge, and I don't know if you agree with this today, is that people don't feel hurt enough by climate change yet to think we really, really got to fix it. They understand the theory of it, but nobody is starving, at least not in the United States. Is that part of the issue?
I think it's part of the issue, and a big part of the issue, and a big part of the challenge to encourage people to be supportive of taking action. I think that our challenge in the United States is not getting people to be more aware of climate change. Now they know about it, they're concerned about it, but the question is, what's the solution? Is there a solution that seems popular and doesn't break the economy and that could support your values and the other things you believe in? And if people were feeling this every day in a sharper way, that they would want to be reaching out for those solutions, but they're not. And it's not so easy. Storms and droughts, to use these weather events to try to convince people to be more interested in pressing for climate change policy action, seems to have worked to some extent, but it's hard to convince people that this touches your life and directly, your health, your way of life. That's the big challenge.
Can we look at a couple of alternatives? Wind and solar have been pushed very heavily. I know that our wind generation capacity has gone up, I think, 3 times since 2009, and solar up 6 times. There was a lot of support for that in the Obama administration in the 2009, what was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, right? Put a bunch of money into it. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. Solyndra went bust with $500 million, so not always better than my horse. But that's now, I think, wind and solar together, 10% of U.S. power generation?
About.
Ballpark. Is that the way of the future?
Well, yes, I think it's the way of the future. Particularly, it's very impressive to me how Germany and other parts of Europe have made a bet on wind and solar. And that means not only continuing subsidies in a way that don't cost any more than they have to, but it means, investments in the grid. It'll mean investments in battery storage. But, in the U.S. we have 20% nuclear. We're probably going to keep that for a long time. It's clear that Germany is really locked into the commitment to phase it out for renewables. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of inexpensive natural gas. That allows you to reduce your emissions. In Germany, I think the reliance on gas will be much shorter term. So the commitment that's been made here to really go to a 70-80% wind and solar economy is very impressive and tends to demonstrate that while it has challenges, it can be done. And I think that'll happen in the U.S. too, and I think the way is set for it, but I think it's going to be slower, both because the nuclear and gas are alternatives, and because we have a little bit more difficult time modernizing our grid so that wind and solar can be delivered from one place to another. Although at some point, when it's easy to get wind and solar in your system up to 20%, 30%, 40%. When it gets to be above 40%, the challenge changes. Engineers and scientists will tell you it changes completely. It's a whole other set of things that have nothing to do with just the fact that wind and solar are cheaper. It's the structural problems. Those are going to be bigger problems in the U.S., I suspect, than in Europe.
I was also interested in your talk. You were very pessimistic, the wrong word, but you warned against relying too heavily on electric vehicles, at least any time too soon. California has done a lot to, as you know, accelerate the adoption of electrics or hybrid vehicles. But the infrastructure, it's huge, right?
The infrastructure problem in the United States is huge. And I'm not worried about relying too much on electrification of the fleet. In fact, I think we need to vastly accelerate it because it's the only thing we've got in the transportation sector right now that's fairly short term. And I think it has to go at a much greater pace. The longer term problem is in a 20 or 30-year transition, you don't necessarily want to bet only on one technology. So it may be that at some point the use of hydrogen produced by renewable energy and fuel cell vehicles will become a big part of this solution. You don't know that yet, or some kind of advanced biofuel. We don't have any of that yet, but you don't really want to bet against everything but electrification. In the U.S., though, in cities it's somewhat easy, but when you look at maps, building an electric charging infrastructure is going to be horrendously difficult and expensive. I had an interesting conversation just a week ago at a workshop with the Baroness Brown is the co-chair of Britain's climate change committee, which actually sets their targets. It's a non-political, semi-political committee, sets the targets 15 years in advance, and Parliament has to either up or down, say up or down. It's a very, out of the political system. And she was saying, well, there are a lot of problems with the massive electrification in Britain, but doing the infrastructure, doing the charging station network is not going to be quite as hard as you think. And I realize that, the way the British countryside is laid out, and perhaps in Germany, where at least the highway network and the rail network is pretty easy to see where you go and what you do. It's going to be expensive, but 60 or 70% of the routes could be electrified in 15 or 20 years. In the U.S., though, it's going to be very, very difficult.
I wonder how you see the role of China in this. So you mentioned BYD have just built their 100,000th electric bus. The Beijing Auto Show last year, there were 29 different electronic car manufacturers, all Chinese, who were all exhibiting. And of course, they've got a very strong support from the government who want to see e-cars because they don't like the pollution from gasoline. They were clearly going to put in a grid or a network of charging stations because the government says thou shalt put in a network of charging stations, and so it will happen. I understand we have a different system in the United States, but are we going to perhaps learn some techniques, at least from the Chinese, if we're so humble?
Well, I think that, yes, I think we're certainly going to learn a lot from the Chinese because, as you said, they're going to do it, whatever it costs. They may make mistakes. If they make mistakes, we'll learn from those mistakes. I can remember going to China 7, 8 years ago. I went several times a year talking to solar and wind companies, and at that time, there were 3 major solar panel companies that were taking over the world market. But the government was subsidizing another 120 solar panel companies. And it was pretty clear that in the end, only 8 or 10 were ever going to survive. And I'm not sure that 8 or 10 have survived. But they can afford to do that. So whatever they set out to do, they will do, and whether successfully or not, or efficiently or not, and we will learn from it. Maybe the best example is nuclear, where the Chinese are in the process this year of hooking up a medium-sized so-called pebble bed high-temperature gas-cooled reactor outside of Beijing, which is an American design. We could have built it in the 1980s or 1990s. We never did. South Africans tried, the Koreans, and they just weren't interested. So this is probably a reactor that can be done modularly, so it's 100 megawatts at a pop. They've got 200 megawatts. It's probably 1,000 times safer than anything that's been built to date and can be built in different sizes and reasonably inexpensively. If this really works, they'll own 100% of the world market in 5 years. Nobody will buy anything in the near future. And nuclear will have a resurgence, not in Europe or the US, I'm quite sure, but in a lot of other parts of the world. So that's the kind of thing that China will, come out of nowhere in a period of 3 to 5 years and help find a solution which we'll all benefit from, if you think nuclear is a benefit. And I put that caveat.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I'll open it up to the floor. And I'm going to bring it back to the carbon tax idea. So I was in South Carolina recently, and the price of gasoline there was about $2.50 a gallon. I fly back to LA, the price of gasoline is $4 a gallon. That's a tax, which Americans are already paying in certain parts of the country, effectively a differential there. I'm wondering, you've been in government, you've been private sector, how is it going to, how are we going to sell that to the American people? That you all are going to have to pay for gas what we pay for in California, for example, or maybe more?
Well, that's I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. Certainly Congress has failed for years and years to increase the federal gasoline tax, leaving the states to get money through increasing state gasoline taxes. And the same resistance, I hear this every day here, is, maybe we should adjust our tax system so that the taxes actually are calibrated to how dirty the fuel is, but if we're going to have a visible, direct increase in energy taxes and energy prices, it's the yellow vest problem. There's going to be as much resistance here to that as in the U.S. Of course, in the U.S., these gasoline costs are are a smaller part of the average family budget. So you'd think this would be somewhat more tolerable than other kinds of tax increases, but it's not. And I don't know the answer, but I think it's one of the 2 or 3 biggest. I mean, you asked another one, how do you bring climate change into somebody's backyard as a personal pressing issue? And second is, how do you justify raising prices on energy and carbon energy, in order to have incentives in the market that drive people to make the right kinds of future decisions. Now, in the case of a federal carbon tax, one would hope that enough of it would go back so that people could see that they're getting money back. We talked before dinner, the ambassador and I, about the fact that in Canada, the Trudeau backup tax, which is placed this year on about half of the provinces that didn't have their own carbon pricing system. So they've sent checks to people before they pay the tax. I mean, as they're beginning to pay, they're giving you 6 months back or something before you've actually been taxed 6 months, right? So people are getting money in advance.
That could work.
Yes, and when it comes to the next election and people say, well, you've been getting a check for 2 years, you elect the other party, you're not going to see that check again. So that's the kind of policy combined with communication that it may take to get more support for the idea of a carbon pricing.
That's the best idea I've heard in a long time. Konstantin has a microphone. If you have a question, please put your hand up, and we'll get to you. Yes, sir, here.
So thank you for the talk. I think it's Sun?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the talk. I thought it was really interesting. And I think, so climate change is really a worldwide problem. And I think one thing that's interesting is that Africa is actually the continent with the highest potential for renewable energy. So do you see that as a potential future investment opportunity for the US and EU, or are our domestic energy kind of businesses going to win out?
I'm not sure this is an answer directly to your question, but it's something that I wanted to say at the end that I'll say now, and then you tell me if I've answered it or not. This is not sort of one of the things that climate advocates don't like to say all that much is this is not really about our emissions at all. Our being the US or the EU, because the difference between what the US would do over 30 years if it just had business as usual or it adopted a really strong emissions reduction program, that delta, that gap, is about, let's say it's about like this, right? The EU is about like this. China is like this. India is like this. And probably two countries forests, Brazil and Indonesia, are like that too. What happens to those forests? So this is not, I mean, what we do in the OECD countries compared to if it's good or bad is 10% of the problem or 5% of the problem. So if you look at it that way, where does that take you? And where it takes me is we not only have to do things that convince people to a public to support lowering our own emissions, the whole program has to be driven to support and encourage the countries that are leaders, like the US and Germany, to develop the technology and develop the ideas and develop the financing to take all this to Africa and to China. And so there are opportunities there for these countries to go into the business of helping decarbonize everybody else. That, I think, is a critical part of this, and that's probably been addressed only somewhat in Europe, a little bit in Canada. Canada, in part, the business community made a decision to support carbon pricing because they said, you tell me if I'm wrong, Mr. Ambassador, we're a very carbon-intensive economy. We're not going to be able to compete in the world unless we get ahead of the game. And pricing carbon's getting ahead of the game. So, but by and large, the notion that the challenge to the developed countries is not just to get their own emissions down, but to develop the technology and the financing and the program and the outreach to help everybody else who needs it a lot more do it. That's absolutely critical. So are there business opportunities in Africa? These, I think, are the business opportunities. How do we help African countries do whatever it is, whether it's their power systems or their forests or the way, the way they develop, to do it on a low-carbon path rather than a high-carbon path. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer.
Bernard.
Thank you, George. That was really fascinating. I wanted to take you back to a conversation that Terry and you were having, which is how do we get climate change to be perceived as a pressing and a personal problem? Because I think that is pretty key to the heart of the success of any kind of climate change policy, is for people to see it as immediately relevant to them and also as something that is urgent. And to me, the question is, how do you do that? And you mentioned the Canadian initiative, which is really about fiscal incentives. Show them the money even before they've spent it, right? But that'll work for almost anything. You show me the money before I've spent it on something. That's to me a very it'll work, but it's not a sustainable solution. And so this gets back to conversations that we've had, which is, what are other ways in which we can frame climate change as a problem? And how is it that we can do this in a way that counters, you didn't talk about it, but of course one of the big barriers to climate change is climate deniers. And so how do you kind of reach those people who don't think so if you think of the spectrum of people who don't think climate change is happening, people who don't think climate change is happening to them, people who think climate change is happening but don't think it applies to them. So there's a spectrum of people. But to me, this is a question of communication. And so I was just wondering how it is that you could, as Terry said, someone who's been in policy, someone who is also in many ways thinking about this from a scholarly way, what do you have to say about this question of climate communication?
Can I answer first and then call on you, Mr. Ambassador? He had his hand up. Partly I need to learn from you, Prerna, about who's studying how it is that you convince people to accept public health programs as part of their values in their tribe when they may otherwise be resistant. And the similarities are great. How do you get people to buy into the need to do something about climate change because it's consistent with their tribal beliefs, their values, their community? It fits with what they believe anyway. So it's just a further extension of what they already believe, not something to counter that has to go against their beliefs. And I think that's, a huge problem. And talking to, over the last few years, I've talked to probably 14 or 15 of what I think are the most knowledgeable 20 people in the United States about climate communications, and who do polling, and ad agencies have done stuff for groups. And, you already know you can't make this look too big. You have to bring it home to a person's backyard and family and health. You have to explain how this is part of a set of life principles that they hold dear anyway. But that's a challenge.
Have you heard about this British company that is using Second World War posters to encourage recycling?
No.
It's like your country needs you to recycle. Okay, this is Iceland.
Make America great again by reducing carbon emissions. Well, I love
We'll get to you.
the ambassador's comments on the question and on the give them the money.
That is certainly a very valid question. We need education, we need awareness, we need mobilization, and what this young lady from Sweden is doing, it's great. But it will not be sufficient, because what we need to do is huge. It's the basic of our civilization. 80% of our energy is coming from fossil fuels. Since the 90s, despite all the efforts we have done, it's still 80% coming from oil, gas, and coal. So as long as CO2 emissions are free, you may have all the awareness, all the mobilization, all the seminars that you want, it will not be enough. If you have a price on carbon, and ideally a world price on carbon, at this very moment in your daily decisions, in the thousands of decisions that a company may do and the individual, the household may do every week, every day, they will have to take into account, how can I save money in choosing what is less costly? And what will be less costly with the price on carbon, if the price is high enough, will be the products and the services that are less emitting. And by this very way, you may be able then, over the time, to avoid a world of more than 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Because scientists are telling us that beyond 2 degrees Celsius of warming, it's another world. And if we continue this way, each of our countries, including Canada, Germany, the United States, if we honor our Paris commitment, we are still in a world of more than 3 degrees Celsius at the end of this century, let alone what will happen at the next century. And it seems that most of our countries will not meet our Paris target for 2030. So it may be a world of 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, which would be awful. So the issue is very big, and I don't see how what George is speaking about with us tonight may be something that we may avoid to do. We need to do a price on carbon and hopefully a world price on carbon.
Let me just give a side note to that with a number. The IMF does studies about carbon, social cost of carbon and carbon subsidies and over the last couple of years. And on average across the world, we basically subsidize infrastructure expenses, investments, at about $15 a metric ton of carbon. So it translates into 12 cents, let's say, at the gas tank. So that's across the world. On average, governments are giving a $15 subsidy to do a more intensive carbon. Then there's the implicit subsidy, which is the harm that the emissions is doing that's not taken account in the price. Let's say that's just $30. So think about this. I don't remember what the numbers are, but it's at least $1 billion a day. So between now and breakfast, someplace in the world, $500 million of investment decisions will be made, that most of those investments are going to last 20, 30, 40 years. And the market is subsidizing, is incentivizing every one of those decisions to be the dirtiest possible decision in climate change. $500 million between now and breakfast. Every day, $1 billion, $2 billion, and it's all going to be, the market is saying, if you do this dirtier, it'll be cheaper, it'll be better off. So if you don't build some alternative price scenarios into this dynamic, that's what we've been doing for 100 years, and we're going to keep doing it.
This gentleman in the middle, and then this lady, and then there's a gentleman in the back there, and then Alexander.
I find what you refer to as uninformed talk in Europe very refreshing, actually. I wanted to ask you, of the three questions you raised, about two of them I have a comment question. With transport, you talk about of course, about electrification and other, similar schemes, and the difficulties. I worked on problems of sustainable transport when I was at Michigan in complex systems. We had grants from Ford and so forth. What became eminently clear is there's really no way to do it without mass transit and fast trains and so forth on a massive scale. Europe has sort of, although we think in America of Europe as being different, it's stagnated in this, and the societies are increasing sort of linearly over a long period of time, individual cars, passenger cars and buses. So I don't know why people don't talk about this. There's the other problem. When you do this, you still have the problem of what I'd like to ask you about, of congestion. So in most cities of the world, you can make whatever kind of cars you want. They're going to be sitting still most of the time, and the efficiencies are terrible. So how do we address this? When I tried to raise this, like we wanted to, the Renaissance in Detroit, right? We wanted to have mass transit installed ahead of time, sort of a Robert Moses of the future, right? And the city planners told us to shut up or they were going to get in trouble. Okay, you ruin everything. So I'd like to ask you about why isn't this discussed? Number two, if you don't mind, you made the statement about the Green New
Deal.
Yeah, as it's great, sort of enthusiastic, but the content is not much there. In Europe, we've had a lot of content, lots of ideas, say in Germany. But what always you see is every time it's taken up by the individual governments or in Europe, people say there's a lack of political ambition. But what I see from studying the details is that maybe the plan doesn't work sometimes. Maybe the technology doesn't exist and you have do we really need a fourth industrial revolution and smart grids and high voltage direct current things that are installed that cost tens of billions of dollars in order, is that the solution? Or maybe France had the solution 50 years ago, if you know what I'm getting at. So there's all this other stuff, decorating policy, and I was very refreshed that yours didn't. If you could comment something on, sort of what is the minimal that's necessary if it's really just a war on carbon, if you see what I'm getting at.
Thank you.
Well, let me take the first one first. I think expanding the public transportation system in the U.S. is going to be very, very hard. And I think as people think about the future of mobility and they look at electrified driverless cars, which are all car shared, So nobody's going to want a car, you just want access to a car. Somehow that's going to lead to less use of energy and less congestion and less emissions. But it's not clear that, since we have no idea how people are going to use, and I think that's a more likely trend than adding traditional public transportation. It's a different way of having public transportation. But whether that's really going to happen very fast and whether it actually makes everything worse rather than better, I don't think that's so clear. The second question you asked was really about, I guess, technology bets. The problem with the Green New Deal, it doesn't have any policy at all. It has aspirations and goals, which are pretty good goals. They're good goals for 2050, maybe 2045, maybe not for 2030. But I do think that to the extent that what you're saying is, do we need a massive new heavy-duty infrastructure program in the U.S., no. We not only don't need it, we don't really want it. But where does that take you if you're talking about the transportation system? I'm not sure. That's challenging.
Thank you very much. I love this conversation about solutions and because I think we have to discuss the big options and thinking about new mobility concepts. I really love that. Thinking about the carbon pricing and how to get it right when we say we're market driven. Love that. I have two comments and one question. The one comment goes on to the communication question back there. I think the polls are pretty interesting to then think about narratives. For example, in the context of the Munich Security Conference we just saw, there were polls made by the Pew Research Center in the US, and they asked 26,000 people or 27,000 people in 26 countries, what are the big security risks? And interestingly enough, number one was climate change, followed, I think, by IaaS and then by cybersecurity or something. So I think people around the world see it as a security risk. So what does that mean for our communication? Where do we pick them up? Second, obviously there were polls made about the energy transition in Germany, getting more local. 90% of the German population, according to recent polls, still support the energy transition. However, they are dissatisfied with the work of the German government with respect to, A, the climate impact of the energy transition, thinking it goes too slowly. Second, and that might be a different camp then, thinking that the government thinks not enough about the social implications. So that tells us a lot about communication and also policy approaches, and I think your policy approach is a really interesting one in that context. So I think that helps us, guide and think about approaches to talk about it. And in this context, you thought it might be difficult for some in the room how you talked about China and India. It was difficult for me because I think if you look at the overall emissions and the cumulative emissions also of the North, obviously we have to move. Even though the absolute emissions of China as a single country is now the biggest in the world, we all have to move to meet the 2 °C target. And the per capita emissions, we are totally not out of the loop of the need for action. And now my question.
Thank you.
Thinking of the coal issue, I'm still surprised by the fact that a really comparatively small amount of workers in Germany, 10,000 or 60,000 in the coal areas, depending on how you count, were able to become a national topic. And it seems similar in the US. You just referred to the number
Absolutely.
of jobs and how they become such a almost toxic topic up to the presidential level, up to their campaigns. I wonder if you have some answer about the why and then how to deal with that constructively. Thank you.
Yeah, very good question. Well, I would just say I'm hoping to do a little informal seminar sometime in the next 2 weeks with a bunch of different people who are pulling themselves together who have some experience in the coal transition issues. And a little organization that I started in the U.S. is doing a series of meetings in coal country in the U.S. over the next 3 or 4 months with some experts and some national environmental folks to try to say to people, what do you think works in these communities? But your real question is, how does this become a political flashpoint? In the U.S., it's because climate change has become so polarized politically. I think that's about to start going downhill, but over the last 8 or 9 years. So the same thing that makes it possible to create a national political issue about building a concrete wall, which is this crystallized opposition to globalism and everything it's brought to a large number of Americans who feel left out, is what allows Trump to blow up the coal workers and say we're going to bring back coal, like we're going to, bring back some form of popcorn manufacture that's been phased out because it's unhealthy or something. It's ridiculous, but it's built into the political polarization that we've seen about climate change and now about Trump, and it's related to this, us and others. It's to the opposition to globalization, and you could say that in the U.S. There's a lot of justification for that. We've now gone through a 10 or 15 year period of creating a huge additional, wealth disparity and seeming inability of government to really cope with healthcare costs. We've gotten a lot of people health care, but there's still a lot of people who can't afford it or don't have it. So there's a good reasons why a substantial portion of the population feels that what it sees to be the global interests and global focus of the country have just left them behind. And I think that's a part of this. I don't think it has anything to do with the real economics or even to do with energy. It has to do with the anti-globalization feeling that's gripped a substantial part of the country that voted for Trump. But that's kind of amateur political analysis. So.
I'm still remembering Al Gore and The Inconvenient Truth, and it seems to have faded, at least for some people, unfortunately and sadly. But that's not what I want to talk about. I've been investing in clean tech for many years now, well over 10 years. And it's been a difficult experience. I've been investing both in Europe and in the US. And it feels like the clean tech revolution was hijacked by China, as Terry, you alluded to. Now, we know that huge infrastructure investments will be needed in order to support the build-out of renewable energy, both on the U.S. continent and also in Europe, and also for the purpose of electrification. And you seem to be quite optimistic. You only brushed on this briefly during your talk. You seem to be optimistic about the ability to meet these infrastructure investments. Perhaps if you could say a few more words about this, where your optimism comes from.
I'm not optimistic about the either financing or the ability of in the U.S. to build out an electrification infrastructure. I'm not optimistic about that at all. In fact, I think that's even U.S. car companies we've been dealing with say, we could build 10 times as many electric cars next year as we're going to build, but and we've ramped up to do this, but nobody wants to buy them. And they want government help. They want more government to get in and subsidize people to buy the electric cars they want to build. So building these vehicles and maybe even subsidizing people, encouraging people to buy them, I don't think that's the problem. And there's going to be a market. If it's not in the U.S. right this minute, it's going to be market for buses and delivery vans in Europe and electric. And I think the infrastructure problem is the problem. And I don't know what the solution is. This is a little in the weeds, but I remember 4 or 5 years ago, I would go to conferences and people would say, well, the utility industry is going through a revolution in the United States. Utility 2.0, they're not going to be utilities anymore, monopolies. And when it comes to building electric charging stations, of course, the people who are going to put the money into this are the Googles of the world, because the information is going to be more valuable than the ability to sell electricity. So our clean tech industry is going to take over electrification infrastructure. Well, a couple months ago I was in Los Angeles, and there's one of the very few charging station companies is trying desperately to raise $20 million to increase its business. And I'm sitting listening to the head of the Public Utilities Commission in California say, well, we just approved $800 million in new investments in storage and electrical infrastructure for 2 utility companies. What that means is the utility companies can go out tomorrow and borrow $800 million from banks, which it takes 5 minutes, because they're going to pay back all these costs by charging ratepayers. Ratepayers across California are going to pay for the charging stations for rich people who have electric cars. Okay, interesting model, but the point is, nobody kind of knows how this is going to get done, and it's not pursuant to anybody's expectations. So we don't even know what the structure, who's going to run this, who's going to get to sell it, who's going to finance it, and we're beginning to find out things that are very different from expectations a few years ago. So I'm not optimistic. I think this is far and away the biggest barrier in the U.S., not just to cars, but to delivery vans and trucks. We're not going to find ways to build the infrastructure fast enough.
Same here. There's a gentleman who had his hand up for a long time next to the picture there.
Thank you for your talk, and especially your consideration of finding the right price for carbon. And sort of on that topic of carbon pricing, to what degree are these sort of, how you refer to non-implicit costs, or these indirect costs of carbon emissions prevalent in the discussion? For instance, in the sort of scientific field of in agriculture, the lessening a window in which pollinators are active and flowers are blooming, being greatly shortened due to climate change, as well as more social ones like climate refugees and future conflict over fossil fuels. So in sort of these higher level conversations about finding the right price for carbon that correctly allocate the amount of the price relative to the damage it can do, to what degree are these on the table?
Well, I have a two-part answer to that. One is, I think that trying to do more research and get more information about the so-called social cost of carbon, what the real costs are, is very important. And how important it is, and many people in the environmental community talk about how we need to get it right, so we need to know what it is so we can build a policy that captures that. And I think ideally that would be wonderful policy. And it's important, you can see how important it is, because the Trump administration has desperately tried to figure out how to get that cost from, $46 to $3, restudy it, and come out with a different number so we don't have to worry about it. But the second part of my answer is, for me, in the sort of raw policy struggle, it's not that important, because I would say what for me is to get the price right is the price that does the most, it's the most effective in getting emissions reductions that can get enacted in the political process. And that has no relationship to the science. It's because you want to be as aggressive as possible, and the curve here is where the political acceptability and the effectiveness cross. A $5 carbon tax in the U.S., a $4 permit price in the EU to ETS doesn't do anything to anybody. But a $45 carbon price in the U.S. hammers coal and starts to make people in the transportation sector think twice or three times. So that's maybe a cynical answer, a response to your question, but where I am, that's the object.
This gentleman here in the aisle, and then there's a lady here, and we'll come down here. We'll walk our way back down.
George, thank you very much. It was a really sharp talk around the question of the carbon. But as an architect and urbanist, I'm also interested in how you balance other kinds of emissions. Living in New York, you realize that 60% of the heat that arises from New York comes from the existing stock of building, right? If you go out into the suburbs, the existing emissions from tarmac and from all the kinds of infrastructure in the suburbs. If you go into industrial agriculture, so there's a huge amount of global warming emerging from the existing infrastructure. How does that balance in your equation with the amount of reduction that comes from carbon reduction?
Well, I think it comes last in the list, but not because it's not important, and indeed, a robust carbon price doesn't necessarily, not only does it not do a lot to transportation emissions according to the models, which have problems, but it also doesn't do much in the building sector, which is also a big problem. But it's even less clear what to do, at least in the U.S., about the efficiency of buildings. My son, the architect, keeps reminding me that very often there's as much emissions embedded in the construction of a building than there is in 30 years of operation. And why the hell doesn't anybody take account of this? But figuring out how in a system in which states and cities have building codes, and it's all part of a political process, how to deal with that on national standards or policies that can really make a difference in the way people construct and operate buildings or other infrastructure. It's just not clear how you go about that, and that's why electrifying the transportation fleet in some ways seems like at least it's a coherent policy and solution. I don't know what the coherent. I know congestion pricing is a good thing for cities to do about transportation. I certainly know that standards built into, LEED standards. I have friends who are pushing to get climate into LEED standards, which they're not, which you sure know more about than I do. All of those things are important. They tend to be local and state. They tend to involve the real estate industry or city governments. And it's a lot of different things, and it's hard to imagine even a coherent framework for saying, here are the 5 things we need to get every major city in the country to do. On the other hand, on transportation, I can say, if we got the 20 largest cities in the country to say that after 2030 you can't bring an internal combustion, not a diesel, any internal combustion engine into the city, I can tell you that would have that one line policy would have a very significant impact on every car manufacturer in the United States tomorrow. So at least I can articulate it, and I can get people to say, do you support this, and how much do you support it? In the building area, it just seems so much more fragmented and difficult. But it's equally, it's the next biggest, the last biggest piece that we haven't grappled with at all.
Thank you.
There's a lady here. I think you had your hand up. Did you
Nope.
have your hand up? I thought.
Oh, it's Anne. She was just...
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for shining a spotlight on this topic. My name is Friedrich. I'm an entrepreneur here in Berlin, and I'm quite bullish on the emission trading system. I'm building a business that wants to empower consumers to take part in the European emission trading system. So I just want to make sure that people are not leaving the room today with the belief that the ETS has failed. Looking at historical data, I think you are right, because the price-building mechanism was not effective enough. But the European Union has, and it's been kind of lost in the fine print, but it is installing a new tool beginning this year, which is called the Market Stability Reserve, which is going to reduce the volume of available allowances in the market drastically, I believe. So it's just a matter of supply and demand, and I believe that price will go up drastically over the next 10 years, which is why I want to empower people to take part in it and maybe even delete allowances from the market. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, anything that encourages carbon trading is probably going to help with the climate. And there have been people, part of the hope to do that evaporated with the low permit price. The story of the EU ETS is that it wasn't designed very well. They gave away too many allowances for free, too many benefits, and then the recession came along. So they weren't really needed, the permits, and nobody bought them, so the price was $3 to $4. In an attempt to fix this, rather than throw it out, the EU system, starting year after next year, I guess, has said, well, 2020 to 2030, we're going to cut the number of permits even steeper, so it's going to be 3.2% a year instead of 2.7% a year. And when there are permits that are not sold, we're going to put those permits into a reserve. We're not going to give them away. We're going to put them into a pot. And if that pot grows a certain amount more every year, we're just going to get rid of those certificates. So they're going to squeeze the number of certificates. And the combination of all that may cause the price to stay at 25 euros or 26 euros and go up, in which case there will be a much more vigorous trading platform and opportunity than there's been for 5 or 6 years. And all of that would be good, because the more you're trading around, there's a market price, the more people are incentivized to figure out how to do things that key to that market price that will be useful investments. I mean, if you're an oil company, you're making a $6 billion investment in a liquid natural gas plant. You don't start to get your money back for the 11 years. All your profits in years 11 to 14. If you don't know what the price of carbon is going to be in year 11, you have no idea whether you're going to make a lot of money or that's going to be a stranded investment. If you know you're going to make the investment and you're going to make it at the lowest carbon way to do it. So that's a part of why carbon trading is important, because it leads to that.
Well, let's take one more question from the gentleman in the back, but while you're making your way back there, let me just insert a commercial break here. George will be giving an expert workshop at the end of May.
Yes, 27 to 29, I think.
Right, on climate policy and politics 2020 to 2030, looking out forwards what the US and Europe can learn from each other. And that, I think, that's going to be at the Bayer headquarters, yes. But we're working on that. So this is a subject we're going to be coming back to. But sir, thank you for your
thank you very much, George, for your inspiring talk. I have a question because of the roles of the different possible instruments. You highlighted very much the price. If you have only a marginal rise, I am the economist, you are a lawyer, so I wonder why you believe so much in price making. And you mentioned the subsidies on the European side in order to foster certain technologies, and on the Chinese case. But I wonder about the role of regulation. You mentioned one example for the cars, but if you understand the Chinese example, there were simply regulations, for example, banning combustion engine-driven motorcycles out of the cities, or in the energy transition, in the Energiewende, the green energy to the grid law has a priority fed in regulations in order to ensure that the renewable energy can be sold to the grid. And others have to queue the line. So I wonder, there's a couple of regulations, or even the internal market regulations on decoupling, unbundling energy production from the network operations. So I wonder, so what is the impact of regulation compared to subsidies and compared to tax incentives?
Dr. Dreer is teaching me about open innovation and not choosing, how important it is not to choose technologies. Going back to the question about electrification versus other things. One of the things that in my organizational work for several years, I spent most of the time pushing for carbon pricing, carbon tax. And it really was only this past year, doing a series of meetings with industry and environmental groups, and looking at the sort of latest round of modeling that's been done by think tanks in the U.S., you've come to realize that a carbon tax at the heart, economy-wide carbon tax is a critical part of any climate policy, but it isn't enough. And so certainly in the transportation sector, the answer may well be you just need, you know, there's certain built-in structural things about the way various sectors of the economy work that a price isn't really going to touch. It's going to touch, but it's not going to really change or change very fast. So maybe you need things completely different from a price. And the example that you mentioned and I just used is, you know, you can think of lots of ways of increasing the price of carbon fuels and incentives for people to buy electric cars and to, you know, to build electrification. But it may be that the single biggest incentive is something that has nothing to do with price. So as somebody said to me, VW sold about 4 million cars last year in China. VW can't make an electric car next year. The Chinese may say next year that 10% of their fleet has to be electric. 400,000 cars just disappeared out of Volkswagen's market. And another 400,000, maybe 800,000 the next year. Do you think that might accelerate their decision to build more electric cars? Has nothing to do with price. So, I mean, that's my answer is that it may be that there are important regulatory devices that have nothing to do with price or the market that may be required if we want to decarbonize at a certain rate. Sorry, you had a comment here. No? Please.
The ambassador gets the last word. Can you wait for the microphone so we can get it?
We need
Please.
a package of policies. It cannot be only one. But if it came to a choice, I would choose a price instead of a subsidy. Because the problem with subsidies is that you will subsidize a lot of things that would have been done anyway. If I give a subsidy for all of us to buy electric cars, many of us would have bought the electric car anyway. They will be pleased to have the subsidy. So it's very costly to have a significant result only with subsidies. We need a price.
It's a great finish.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thank you for your question.